Hi students, we're back. And in this section, we're going to talk about additional content from chapter 2 about finding and reading the research. We have already talked about how research that is published in scholarly journals is probably ideal for beginning your own research. We're going to be looking into consulting scientific sources, finding those sources, and how to read that research. Now, we're talking about it here. You're reading about it in your book. We're going to spend a lot of time practicing it because finding research isn't the easiest thing. So, we're going to talk about it and talk about how to find it and how to review it. Okay, so we're going to be talking about consulting scientific sources. Within psychology, there are two journal articles. Remember, we talked about how journal articles are almost like professional magazines, and each chapter is a different study that's been published. These are kind of like the gold standard for scientific sources in psychology. Not what we find in Wikipedia, not what we find online. These are the most important sources, these journal articles. Remember how we talked about them being peer reviewed? We talked about how they have been um, reviewed by somebody else in the field. And so we're going to talk about those particular sources, these two sources. Now, there are typically two general kinds of journal articles. There are empirical journal articles and review journal articles. So let's talk about both of them. Empirical journal articles report a study. Maybe it's more than one study, but we're going to know it's an empirical journal article if it has a method section with participants and it has a results section that usually has statistics in it. That's how we know it's an empirical journal article. Now, this other kind of article is good, but it serves a slightly different role. A review journal article will summarize prior research in an area. So sometimes this is a good place to start if you just want kind of a big, broad overview of all the research that's been done. There are typically two kinds of review journal articles. They're what are called literature review articles, where the author will pull several studies that have been done by other researchers. So they'll pull several of these empirical journal articles and they will summarize them and try to synthesize them. There's also a different kind of a journal review article that's, I don't know, I want to say probably in the last 10, 15 years become pretty popular. It's called a meta-analysis. And in a meta-analysis, they go and they find the prior research that's been done by others, and they specifically look at their method section and they look at their statistics, and they make comparisons across the statistics in terms of effect sizes. And we'll talk about effect sizes more a little bit later this term. But the meta-analysis kind of dives pretty deeply into the statistics of the other articles and compares them that way. Whereas the literature review is really just kind of comparing the the studies and comparing what their findings are, but not digging as deeply into the results, the statistics, as well as to the methodology. All right. So how do you know? How do you know if you're looking at a journal article, you found something and you think it's a journal article? How do you know if it's an empirical journal article or a review journal article? Well, let's talk about it. Okay, empirical journal article. Here is an example. Now, here is the reference for the article. It comes from the journal Neuropsychology and Cognition in Aging, and the article is Improvements in Executive Function for Older Adults Through Smartphone Apps, a randomized clinical trial comparing language learning and brain training. Okay, so this was published in 2023. It's really pretty new. Now, the first thing you're going to see when you look at an article is the abstract. And this is a summary of the entire article. But if you want to know if this is an empirical journal article, remember it will have a method section with participant and results. Typically, if you look somewhere in the middle of the abstract, and I've got it highlighted here, you're going to find the clues that this is a method, has a method section. So it's a randomized clinical trial. That's a method that they used. But they had 76 adults who were assigned to either 16 weeks of Spanish learning using the app Duolingo, 30 minutes a day, or an equivalent amount of brain training using the app Brain HQ, or they were on a wait list control group. All right, so this tells us this is an empirical journal article because we have information about the participants in the study. Okay, what about a review journal article? What's that going to look like? Now, remember, a review journal article is going to summarize prior research. Now, this is a similar study, and you can kind of tell by the title, but let's also look at the abstract. So the title says a game a day keeps cognitive decline away. It's a question mark, a systematic review and meta-analysis of commercially available brain training programs in healthy and cognitively impaired older adults. Now again, just looking at the title, if you're looking carefully, you should see systematic review and meta-analysis. Remember, those are those comparisons across multiple studies. um, so this is going to be one of the review articles. They didn't really do data collection themselves, but they looked at a bunch of other empirical studies, and those they're reviewing those other empirical studies. And so here's our abstract. If we didn't notice it in the title, what would kind of give us a tip off in the abstract? Well, it says to address this issue, the current meta analysis investigation examined evidence from 43 studies with this many participants. Now, the participants weren't in this study, they were in the other studies, but they're evaluating the commercial training programs with two separate populations, healthy older adults and the older adults with mild cognitive impairments. All right, so this is a tip off that this is a review article. Now, the two types of research, the empirical studies are great for figuring out what method would be good for your own project. And the review articles are sometimes good for a good kind of overview of what the findings are in the field. Okay, other sources. Well, you can obviously look for other scientific sources. You could look for chapters in edited books. You could look for full length books. And I've even had students ask, is it okay for me to look at textbooks? Well, I think these are good starting places, but keep in mind that edited books and full length books and textbooks are not often peer reviewed. That means that maybe an expert gathered content together and put it together into a book, and maybe they had experts in the field write different chapters, but these are not peer reviewed in the sense that somebody else who doesn't know the author has reviewed it for scientific rigor and to make sure that it's a valid and reliable study. So these sources are a nice place to start, but you don't want to use these sources heavily or use them as much as you would journal articles. All right, so finding legitimate scientific sources. Now, we're going to talk about two sources of scientific research. We're going to talk about PsycInfo mostly, and then I'm going to mention Google Scholar too. Now, Google Scholar, I'm sure you're familiar with Google Scholar. You can look online, you can access Google Scholar. There are no restrictions to accessing Google Scholar. Now, the challenge with Google Scholar is that it's not going to just be psychology based, it's going to be everything based. So you might have to sift through a lot. But the flip side of that is that with Google Scholar, you can do it from home and you can just pretty much go online and find it. Now, PsycInfo is different. PsycInfo is the database I'm going to really push you to use for a variety of reasons. Um, so PsycInfo is a database for finding psychology articles. So it's going to have psychology, and there are ways to open it up so you look at other fields, but it's going to have the articles that are probably most relevant to the research you want to do. Now, I will also say that the database is maintained by APA, which is the American Psychological Association. So there's a professional organization that kind of maintains the database and filters the database. The articles that are in PsycInfo tend to be peer reviewed. They're not all, but they do tend to be peer reviewed. And here's the thing, you can access PsycInfo through the WU portal. Now, this doesn't mean that you will get full text access to all of the sources right away, but you can get full text access to the sources through interlibrary loan, and it's not going to cost you anything. So I would really encourage you to use PsycInfo, but you do have to go through the portal to get it. You can't just type in PsycInfo on your computer at home and access this database. Western pays for this subscription, and so you've already paid for it with your fees. I would encourage you to use it. So when you get into Psych Info, we're going to practice this in class. You're going to see a set of search boxes that looks something like this. You'll have one line for putting in a major variable, and you'll have another line for putting in a second variable. You don't want to put everything in one line because then that's not how the database works. But when you do that, when you put this together and do the search, you can see from this one, I got 192 articles. And then when you start to look down into the articles, if you click on this, and you can't right now because it's not in there like that, there is an article, it's an abstract, and then you can see if it is available full text, etc. So we're going to be using PsycInfo a lot, but it is accessible through the Woo portal, and it'll get you access to the best research in psychology. Okay, so finding the research, we're going to spend time in class talking about finding the research, but let's talk about what happens when you find an article. How do you read the research? Now, sometimes students are a little overwhelmed by these sources because, again, these sources are not written for you. They're written for people that are experts in the field. But you're a beginning scientist, you're a budding scientist, and so we are going to stretch ourselves and get good at reading research articles. So the first thing is knowing what to look for in an article. So these are the main components. This is kind of like your roadmap. Every article will have an abstract. It'll have an introduction section. It'll have a method. Notice there's no S here. A lot of people make that mistake, but S is not the way that psychologists usually talk about that section. There is a result section. There is a discussion section and references. So that's your roadmap. Let's talk about each of these parts. Okay, so we're going to talk about the abstract and the introduction section. So the abstract of an article is a summary of the entire article. Typically, the researcher will write this section last because it's a summary that includes what the results were and what they think those results mean. So we are going to use this particular example. This comes from Perceptions of Forgetfulness in Adulthood is the name of the article. It comes from the Journal of Genetic Psychology, and it was a 2021 article. This is what it's called. And again, looking at the title, you kind of have ideas about what this is about. It has to do with perceptions. It has to do with forgetfulness. It has to do with adults. Okay, so here's the abstract. Now, I'm not expecting you to read through the whole thing, but what we can see is that there were 2 experiments. They examined younger and older participants' appraisals of memory failures in a fictitious character, portrayed as younger in their 20s or 30s or older in their 60s or 70s. So participants read a vignette. Vignette is like a story. They get you to imagine something happening where a forgetful behavior had minor or more severe consequences for the target or for the character in the social environment. And so then if we continue to read this, we'll learn a little bit more about what they did. We'll learn a little bit more about what the results were. But that's what happens in an abstract. It's a summary of the entire article. This is a great place to start if you don't know if this is an article that will be good and helpful for your project. The title might give you some clues, but the abstract will usually give you more clues. Okay. So the next section of the article is the introduction. And the introduction is probably the longest part of the paper. It will explain the topic of the study. It will describe any theory that goes into the background. Why are they doing this study? What are the theories they're trying to address here? And it will describe empirical background, so prior research. So when you're reading the introduction, you're getting a sense about the topic, you're getting a sense about that theory, remember the theory data cycle of research, and then you're learning a little bit more about what other research already exists. And then you're also learning about the goals for the current study, the hypothesis. So the next section of the paper is the method section. Now, the method section will tell you how the researchers conducted the study. Now, in a method section, most of the time there are going to be subsections to organize this section. Now, this section is usually written with enough detail so if you wanted to do the study yourself, you'd have kind of a roadmap of how they did it. You'd have enough information for replication. So the participants section is going to tell you who participated in the study. So here's that study again that we were talking about. And in this study, they had 96 persons. 48 were Louisiana State University undergraduates, and we have their mean and standard deviation ages. And they participated for extra credit in a psychology course. And there were also 48 community dwelling older adults who were 71 years old with a standard deviation of 5. And they got compensated $5 for their time. So this is a little bit of information about who the participants were in the study. Another section you're likely to see in an empirical study is a material or apparatus section. Now, sometimes a study will have both a material section and an apparatus section, but sometimes they'll usually have one. Okay, for this study, they had a material section and they're telling us about the vignettes that they used. So now remember, we talked about a vignette being like a little story. So in this one, they say, see Appendix A. And I always get excited when I see this because this tells you that if you went to the appendix, you would see their materials and you could use them yourself. So here is the vignette. So it's a little story. So Jim was either 23 or 63, and he had planned a trip to the shopping mall, and he had his mother's birthday. And this kind of tells you what the participants had to read. All right, so those are some of their materials. There's also a procedure, and a procedure kind of walks you through what happened for participants from the start of the study to when they finished the study. So here's a little bit of information from that study. They talk about their design. And so we know this was an experiment. We'll know more about this. It was a 2 by 2 mixed factorial. So they compared participants who were younger and older. They had the vignette being younger and older. And then they had different consequences, a minor or severe consequence. And participants were tested in small groups of up to 4 people. Half of them were presented the vignette about the forgetful target who was younger, half got the forgetful target who was older. So we go through the procedure there. All right. The next section is the results section, and the results section is going to give us statistical tests used to evaluate the hypothesis. There might be paragraphs that report of specific tests, and we'll talk about what those tests might be later in the term. They might have tables, they might have figures, but this is the place where they're actually testing the hypothesis with numbers. So this is a little bit of content that you might see in a results section. So they talk a little bit about how they scored things. They're telling you to look for means on a table. And then they're telling you that they did the specific kind of a statistic, the multivariate analysis of variance. So this is a type of a statistic. And we'll talk about what that is, but that's what you're going to see in a results section. Okay, last 2 sections. The discussion section summarizes the study's results. Now, often the discussion is the opposite of what you saw in the introduction section. It'll include many of the same components. So it's going to summarize the study's results. So here is our discussion. The present results demonstrate that memory failure appraisals were comparable for younger and older participants whose ratings of the cause of forgetting in memory opinion ratings did not differ from each other. So they've got a little bit of results right there. It will also connect the results to prior research and the theory. Remember how the intro talks about what the big theories are and also prior research? That should happen again in the discussion section. So here we've got them connecting it with Cherry and Brigham. And then down here, with respect to forgetful characters, here's previous research. Here's how our study fits with that. They're also going to talk about this study's contribution. How does it fit with prior research? How is it different? They're probably going to talk about limitations and other possible explanations. So here's a paragraph from the discussion that says the present study should be considered in light of at least 5 methodological limitations. Okay, so here they're going to talk about what the limitations are and other possible explanations. And then finally, they're going to give suggestions for future research, which is what they do here too. Additional research to increase the diversity of the materials in the participant samples is desirable. Future research where consequences vary along a single stimulus dimension is needed. They're talking about, when they talk about their limitations, they're also talking about what should be the focus for future research. And then finally, references. References is our full listing of all the sources that appeared in the article. Now, this should be at the end of the paper, and this is a great source for more research. So, if you've read an article, the article's really good, you feel like it's going to be super helpful, look at these references, and this can often lead you to another study that you can use within your project. All right, so this is the end of this section. I will see you in class.